Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is an antique Kampilan, and one that has been featured on my channel in the past, though since it was featured my camera work has slightly improved, as has my audio quality, and I can actually feature it a little bit better in greater detail. So since I've sold this sword and it's going off to its new owner, it's my last chance to do that, and it's a pretty awesome sword, and I want to talk a little bit about it with you. Hopefully you find it interesting. Now, to me, Kampilan are interesting because it's just a sword that I became fascinated with through my study of Filipino martial arts. I studied Eskrima. One of the swords that we learned to use in that, or one of the styles, was longsword, and it was really training to use this. Now, the style of Eskrima that I learned used it primarily one-handed and fed from the shoulder, just a different way of using a sword than, well, the other ways that I've learned in the past. So anyway, it got me fascinated with Kampilan, and I keep an eye out for good deals on antiques, and this is one that came up some time ago. It's been in my collection for a number of years, and now it's leaving me. So anyway, I'm going to share with you some of the bits and bobs, fits and features, and then I'll talk about some of the cool stuff that this sword has and some of the nuances and neatness of it. I'm not going to cut with it. It's an antique, and it's not mine anymore, but I will talk about the build quality and some nuances of geometry that hopefully are interesting. Anyway, I'm going to start with the end bit right here. So this is supposed to be the mouth of a crocodile, as I understand it, or some mythological beast. I've heard it described in a few different ways, but effectively, it's not a great handle to grab two-handed. So you can imagine that if I flip this sword up, the edge being over here, that my second hand will go here, and it's not super convenient to grab. Now, you can grab it, but it's not super fun with two hands, I suppose I'd say. But there's some elaborate carving in here. Now, sometimes on this front face, there would be hair that would be stuck in. And the hair could be human hair, it could be horse hair. It could, as I've heard, have, some sort of particulate or something to blind somebody if you whacked them with the butt of the weapon and you would get it in their eyes or something like that. Or it could just be the totality of enemies that you've killed. There's a lot of mystery, or rather kind of myth, I guess I would say, about some of the Kampilan that I hear, but I don't necessarily see represented in historical examples. But nevertheless, every now and again examples will have little bits of hair or tufts of hair or something stuck in this flat bit here, which does not help hold on to it. There is often elaborate carving on these as well. This one is not necessarily super elaborate. I suppose the higher status you were, to maybe a show of wealth or status, they could be very elaborate, sometimes adorned with silver. This one has some carving and whatnot in it. There are some spots where it's been hollowed out and the carving is nothing. It's not particularly simple, but it's also not very elaborate. Now, often I would say the carving on these types of swords looks, by comparison, crude, frankly, to some of the other stuff that I've seen on Japanese swords, or that I've seen on Chinese swords, or that I've seen on a number of others. But it's fair to say as well that I haven't personally had a really high status example, and those are often the examples that I tend to get with Japanese, Chinese, and European style swords. Regardless, the carving is unique and interesting. They all tend to have this kind of mouth open area here. This is a common spot that breaks. Very often the woodwork is cracked and you're missing the lower jaw portion, I guess, or the nose portion maybe of the crocodile here. That's a common spot that tends to break on them. I believe that's the nose, or the upper mouth of it. Also, sometimes there is a little pin that goes through this section where I imagine, I haven't seen, that the tang may run down and then there's a pin or some sort of manual connection that runs through here. I've seen that from time to time. Whether or not it's in the tang is tough to tell because I don't often destroy antiques to see them. But in the antique tangs that I've seen, some of them run down, and it gives me the impression there may be a pin that runs through, holding it in, or maybe just stopping it from breaking in half or something. I'm not sure what else it's doing, but I thought it went through the tang. From the elaborate carved area, there is a handle. Now, Filipino weapons, in my mind, particularly the reproductions, tend to have almost a circular handle, and circular grips were not, as I understand it, terribly uncommon, as I see bolo or old other examples of knives or blades from the Filipino area. They often have round handles. This one does not, and I don't know exactly how old it is, but it's certainly elliptical in shape. It really indexes well, and it also locks into my hand really, really well. If I hold it one-handed and then try to twist the crossguard, which is often a thing I do to determine how much connection I feel with a sword, it really feels substantial and tactile and connected to my hand. It's easy to grip, easy to index, easy to feel where that edge is. And it's not ovoid, and it kind of juts in. You can really feel where the back and where the front are. Now, where it moves up to the crossguard area, there's a lot of cracks. This handle, this kind of pommel area here, running down through the grip, is all carved out of one piece of wood, near as I can tell, and I don't think that's terribly uncommon for Kampilan. So it's cracked and it's lost a little bit of its of its durability here. Not uncommon. I don't know exactly what kind of wood it is, but often old wood will age, it'll crack, it'll expand and contract with the various levels of humidity and temperature, and this is no exception. It's held up actually pretty well. Often examples are much worse than this, but regardless, it's lost and kind of started to pop out and deform from this crossguard area here. What's left is some cord. I don't know if the cord was original or not. It's on there and it comes off if you hold it or use it. I've done my best to preserve it. I don't know exactly if this is how old it is, but I suspect it was added at a later time. You can kind of see some of the difference in age from the wood. The part that's been covered by the cord longer, it has a slightly different color to it. Now the handle as well, one thing that is a nuance of the construction here is this wasn't rounded. The handle, or the grip, is made into like a dovetail, or well, at least a square peg that goes, or rectangular peg that goes into a rectangular slot on this grip here. And what that's going to do from a construction standpoint is, however the tang is secured in here, I don't see pins or pegs running through, so presumably there's some sort of pitch or something that runs in some sort of adhesive. There could be a peg or something in there that I'm just not seeing, but this grip is not likely to move around from the crossguard. The crossguard being made of wood, the fact that there's a large wooden peg that runs into it means that it's not going to twist or manipulate particularly easily. If it were round, it'd be a lot more likely to move around, so something from a stability standpoint. And the tolerances are really quite close here. So where I can make out where the grip has moved out of the crossguard area is pretty tight. There's not a lot of gap between it, and so from a construction perspective, some aspects of Filipino craftsmanship tend to look crude, but where it counts from a structure perspective, it does not appear to be. It seems like the tolerances are very, very tight there, and so I'd imagine that this crossguard is pretty well seated, or was when it was newly made. Moving up to the crossguard area here, this one has some elaborate little details. Now there's a hole on the front, so I don't know what this hole was for. Every now and again you will see what's called the staple, and so typically these are used right-handed. So on one side of the grip there will be a thing called a staple, and it's this iron bar that runs around it, and that iron bar could hold a chainmail or something like that. I don't see a lot of historical examples with chainmail, but maybe leather or something to guard you against cuts. It wouldn't help you if you got hit with a percussive hit or something that broke your fingers, but it might keep them from getting chopped off, and it could also act maybe like a nagel or prevent things from running down the blade and chopping into your knuckles. This one doesn't appear to have it, and the hole that I see doesn't appear symptomatic with other staples that I've seen on Kampilan. The guard is made of wood, has even less carving than the kind of crocodile head up here. It may not be a crocodile, it could be some other animal. I could be saying it wrong as well, but there are some carvings here and they are elaborate, and there's also some dimension to the guard too. So it swells out in the middle, it's a little thicker there towards the ends, it's a little thinner, and it has this little shapeliness to it, which is not super uncommon. A lot of Filipino Kampilan that I've seen have very similar cross guards. They're pieces of wood that look like they could take a hit or two, but they're wood and would need to be remade if they took a certain amount of damage, though that would be an abundant resource, which would not be terribly hard to come by. They do seem to have a similar kind of shape. Not often are they upswept, but usually I see them kind of canter down a little bit. They're also typically large enough to act as a crossguard, at least for a blade coming down from, if you're parrying or something like that and it rides down your sword and impacts, but they're not long enough to do at least what I would consider a lot of binding, and my experience with Filipino martial arts doesn't typically use the crossguard offensively. Not that it couldn't be, but it's not a facet of the martial art that I learned, though I'm certainly not an expert at it. Moving on to the blade, the pointy stabby part. This has also just a lot of interesting stuff going on in it. So right at this base section where the blade meets the crossguard, there's a gap in the crossguard. This is something I call out quite a bit. I can't make out a whole lot of pitch or adhesive or something, but there's a little bit of a gap there. It doesn't go very deep before you start to see some sort of adhesive kind of clogging it up, so water doesn't seem to really flow down there. But the base of the area here has little shoulders, so it's wide and then kind of pretty drastically tapers down to a narrow section about 2 inches up the blade, and that's also where it's thickest. So it has these little shoulders that seem to reinforce and get wider as it goes to the grip. It tapers down a little bit, and then also the spine is particularly thick here. The blade is a little over 1 inch, kind of at its narrowest section, and then they taper out and get quite a bit wider up here towards the barb section. It gradually widens, but it also thins out slightly. And it's a little bit deceptive if you see it in the camera, because the geometry of the blade is such where the center of the blade is thickest. It's basically a big oval. It's slightly flat on the back and very sharp on one edge, but it's thickest in the middle, and it doesn't have a central ridge or anything like that. It just has a kind of ovoid shape, a lenticular cross-section, I think is what it's called. Anyway, it runs that throughout the length of the blade. This one in particular is also not riddled with a lot of hammer marks, or you can certainly see signs of handmadeness in the flats of the blade, but it's overall relatively clean. You can make out some indications of folding, though it's tough to see. I'm not sure exactly what this was made from. I suspect it was probably edge quenched as well. There's some indication that the edge is harder than the rest of the sword, and there's small imperfections over the surface of the blade. But this lenticular cross-section, or this oval cross-section, is something that I often see missed on modern reproductions if you find them. The TFW and the BCI Kampilan that are available for purchase have a very strange, well, at least strange to me, cross-section from what I've seen historically. I don't see that cross-section represented on any antiques that I've come across. Not to say it didn't exist, but it's not something that I've seen. The other examples that I've had from Kampilan have been the Hanwei one, which is no longer produced, and the Chris Cutlery one, which is no longer produced. And the Chris Cutlery one is a little closer, but it has a thicker spine, and it tapers down a little differently than this one does, and doesn't have the same dimension as an antique does. And I haven't seen a modern reproduction that really shows this kind of cross-section, but it ties in well with what I learned in the martial art. It's supposed to be a little heavier towards the top, but you're also supposed to be able to move this thing and whip it around pretty quick. And you're supposed to be able to touch the back, so it's not sharp, but it's also not supposed to dig into your hands, and it's supposed to be a pretty effective cutter. And this cross-section is lenticular, it's widest in the center, and then profiles back or tapers back a little bit. By contrast, what I often see on modern reproductions is basically one giant wedge, and so that I don't see them quite preserving or replicating this kind of geometry, which is what I've seen on every example of Kampilan that's an antique that I've had, and I've had a dozen or so over the course of the years. Anyway, it thins out quite a bit towards the top here. I'll try to put some dimensions and whatnot that I can gather in the description down below if you're curious. The barb as well, what I have heard this is for picking up skulls after you decapitate them, that this is an executioner sword. I don't know the truth of that. That's some of the mystery that goes into or mystique that goes into the blade. But there's often a barb on here, and the barb often has little teeth on it. It doesn't make it a terribly effective stabber. Not that you can't stab somebody effectively enough to make them uncomfortable, but it's going to be tough to run somebody through. This barb will stop, or at least take parts of it with you if it goes through. So you're going to have guts poking out the other end. What I've learned from this barb is also that it was for hooking things. So in the study of Kampilan, as I studied it in Eskrima, the barb on the back could be used to hook and grab things. And I haven't seen an antique, at least I haven't purchased one or held one in hand that's had a barb big enough to really do that effectively. They all tend to be kind of little stubby things like this that might help you pick up a skull, but it's not going to help you grab somebody's ankle in a meaningful way. You could scratch them, irritate them, but the barb tends to not be terribly effective. Apart from if you stab somebody with the barb and retrieve it, it's not that it won't be effective. It will probably mess up and make a very gapy, teary wound and grab stuff in and be somewhat, potentially loath to come out. Anyway, the barb or tip on this is what I commonly see on Filipino antiques that I've come across anyway. Though the majority of ones that I've come across have either been probably 19th century antiques as opposed to something earlier. Well, I don't know anyway, I suspect that that's what they are. Not 100% sure. Anyway, the geometry on this I find pretty interesting. This one also is quite a bit longer. A lot of the antiques that I've come across, being that I suspect they are kind of 19th century pieces, tend to be around 27 inches long, and this one is a little bit longer than that. So it's the longest Kampilan that I've seen, and it has the most variation. It doesn't have the staple, it doesn't have chainmail, it doesn't have the hair, it doesn't have all the features that you might find on a Kampilan, but the longer blade was a little different than the examples that I've seen, and as I understand it, they could be quite long. So anyway, that's what I've got to share with you about this Kampilan. I hope it was interesting to hear some of the nuances. I think Kampilan are super cool. I'd love to see more replicas and more examples of them. It's a sword type that I don't think gets enough attention, and it's kind of cool looking. I wouldn't also mind seeing like just a different interpretation of it. I do find that the reproductions that have been out there, given that that's the focus of my channel, tend to be kind of lame on the carving. They make a round handle or something that isn't particularly good. They lack some of the other fanciness that you might hope to find on a Kampilan, like the hair or the staple or some sort of hand covering, and they kind of miss on the geometry. It'd be kind of neat to see either this blade produced with a different style hilt that's a little bit more ergonomic, or kind of the full featured set of a Kampilan. Anyway, that's what I'm gonna stop with. Hopefully it's been an interesting video. I hope the new owner also enjoys the Kampilan. That's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.